What I'm going to do is, mostly I'm going to read each. Before I begin reading, am I not doing the thing? No, I'm doing it. I'll just stand like this the whole time. It'll be really natural. We'll all be very comfortable together. Hello. Wow. Maybe I'll just talk like this. Anyway, I'm gonna move it back a little bit because I'll tend to bump into things and get sort of animated when I speak. Okay, so one of the things I want to talk about, I'll try not to have kind of spoilers. The book is, when I do readings, an interesting thing has sort of happened that I hadn't planned on, which is that people will come up to me and they'll say, "This book is so sad," and I think, really, I had no idea that it was a sad book, and I still, in many ways, kind of don't think that it is, but it made me have to sort of rethink what I think about the notion of beauty and what I think of the beauty's role in our lives. And I mean beauty not as ornament or as, prettiness, but beauty as a sort of fundamental part of the fabric that kind of makes up being a human being. And I think that one of the things that I was trying to do with this book is that even though these people do have very challenging circumstances, they are also saved by, in very small and large ways, by the sort of intervention of beauty in their lives and their kind of experience of beauty in their lives, which I think is a pretty resonant human experience. We've all sort of been in trouble at some point in our lives, and at some point in our lives, something or someone that was beautiful. And when I say beauty, I really do mean beauty can come in so many forms: a connection with another human being, a song, a sort of a feeling that might come over you, something that you remember, and it intervenes in those moments of trouble. And while it may not change your circumstance, it certainly changes your ability to go through your circumstance. And I think another part of beauty is a notion of kind of having dreams and hopes that sort of go through lots of turmoil in certain ways, that are shaken in certain ways. Our ability to hope sometimes is shaken in certain kinds of ways. But this notion of having dreams, of being hopeful, I think is a thing that also carries us through, and I think is one of the more profound aspects of what it is to be a human being. This idea that in moments of turmoil and moments of difficulty, you can have some notion of what might come, or who you might be, or who your children might be, and that this notion can carry you through, though the notion itself is challenged. And to that end, before I begin to read, I wanted to read a poem by an incredible poet named Gwendolyn Brooks, the sort of incomparable Gwendolyn Brooks. And this poem is called Kitchenette Building. And I like to read it because it's really beautiful, and also because there's a poet named Elizabeth Alexander, who some of you may or may not know, who likes to read this poem, and I like to do things that Elizabeth Alexander does, so I'm going to read it. And I used to just do it in front of my bathroom mirror, and now I get to do it in front of you all. So that's very exciting. At any rate, so I'm going to read this poem called Kitchenette Building. It is relevant. I'm not just being self-indulgent. Well, I am a little, but Kitchenette Building. We are things of dry hours and the involuntary plan, grayed in and gray. Dream makes a giddy sound, not strong like rent, like feeding a wife, like satisfying a man. But could a dream send up through onion fumes its white and violet, fight with fried potatoes and yesterday's garbage ripening in the hall, flutter or sing an aria down these rooms, even if we were willing to let it in, had time to warm it, keep it very clean, anticipate a message, let it begin? We wonder, but not well, not for a minute. Since number 5 is out of the bathroom now, we think of lukewarm water, hope to get in it. And the reason that poem resonates with me so much, and I think the reason that it resonates for me with this book so much, is that it really is about this idea that if you find yourself in very, very difficult challenging kinds of circumstances, in the places where we don't necessarily think that dreams flourish or would have a chance to grow, if the possibility of beauty, if the possibility of hope were to present itself, would we recognize it? I think the poem says, yes, we would recognize it, and we would tend it, and we would try and make it grow. And I think that that essentially is Hattie's journey in this book. She is, when we meet her, she's a very young woman, and some very horrible things have happened to her. And for much of her life, she finds herself, she finds her capacity to hope and her capacity to appreciate moments of beauty somewhat diminished by the difficulty of her circumstance. But in the end, there is something in her that recognizes a dream. And in her way, she finds the capacity to tend it, to let it begin. And it takes her whole life for her to get there. You know, we meet her when she's 17 and something really horrible has happened to her. And when the book ends, she's 71. And she, at that moment only, it's taken this, you know, sort of 60 years of her life almost to get to this point where she says, well, it is possible. I can tend it. I can let it begin. And that's sort of her story, and I think that's the book's story. And I think that obviously the book is, you know, a great deal about the Great Migration, or not so much about, but that's its backdrop. But I think that the story is relevant also on a sort of larger, kind of human way, you know, this notion of finding something, tending it, nursing it, a dream, our hopes, love, you know. So I'm going to read a little bit from the book. I'm going to read from a chapter that I usually mark but didn't, so excuse me, as I rifle through the pages for a minute. I'm going to read from a chapter called Ella. I signed a book by a woman named Ella. I don't know where she is, but anyway, it was very nice. For a woman named Ella just a little while ago. This chapter is sort of in the middle of the book. For those of you who haven't read it, Hattie Shepherd is the title character. She leaves Georgia in 1923 with her mother and two sisters under sort of great duress, because obviously, as I said, it's 1923, and so she's in the South, so this is, you know, sort of under the racial terrorism of Jim Crow. Her family flees kind of under the cover of night kind of thing. And they arrive in Philadelphia. Hattie gets married quite young when she's 17. She has two children, and then through the course of the next several decades, she goes on to have 11 more children and one grandchild. And in this particular juncture, this chapter called Ella, Hattie and her husband, whose name is August, have had one last very unexpected child. Hattie is in her mid-40s. She really was not into this notion of having any more kids. She thought that she was done. She was very happy to be done, but she wasn't. So she, at the point when this happens, the family, who's always been kind of struggling, they're in very particular economic duress. And so they make a very difficult decision to give Ella, this last-born child, to Hattie's sister, whose name is Pearl. And Pearl has stayed in the South. She lives in Georgia, where Hattie has come from, and she and her husband are very prosperous. So their sort of economic circumstances are the exact opposite of Hattie and her husband's circumstances. And Pearl and Benny, her husband, are also childless, and this has been a great source of difficulty for them. And so Hattie and August make this decision to give away their last child. And I found it, oh good. It was very casual. Did you see how I was looking and I'm still talking? It's really good. Anyway, so the section that I'm going to read is from the end of that chapter, and Pearl and Benny have been driving up from Georgia to collect the baby, Ella, and then go back down. And right where I'm going to read is when they arrive at Hattie's house. One other name you will encounter is Marion, who is Hattie's other sister, but Pearl and Benny are the important ones. I ought to pack up Ella's things, Hattie thought. She rubbed her cheek against the smooth spot on top of the baby's head where the hair hadn't grown in yet. She stood in the doorway and scanned the street for Pearl and Benny's Buick. Ella had gotten old enough to hold on to things with her fist, Hattie's nose or chin or a lock of her hair. And she had learned to give kisses, though she kept her mouth open in a round O, suction kisses, August called them, He was delighted with her, as he was with all of the children. He treated them like bear cubs at the circus, and they loved him for it. He let the little ones come into the bathroom while he shaved, and they watched him as raptly as they would a picture show. He taught them to whistle songs he'd heard on the radio. August was a buffoon, and they adored him. Hattie kept them alive, and they barely smiled when she entered a room. Hattie didn't know how to be a different kind of mother. She squeezed Ella. "Maybe with you I could do better," she whispered in her daughter's ear. "Maybe this time." But it was too late. Everything was already decided. Ella closed her fist around Hattie's earlobe and giggled. I ought to put her in her blue dress and pack her things, Hattie thought again. But then the blue dress was for company or for outings, and she and her daughter still had another hour together. Hattie decided to put the milk bottles out on the stoop. Maybe she'd sweep too before Pearl arrived. Fallen leaves were thick on the steps, and Hattie's was the only porch not swept clean. Ella cooed at some butterflies flitting around the bushes near the porch steps. It was her first autumn. Hattie wondered what she must think of it, or even if she'd noticed that the summer had faded into the burnt yellow and orange of fall. At least Ella wouldn't have to endure the northern winter. Hattie had never gotten used to it. She didn't suffer from nostalgia. The South was gone from her, but the northern winter left her raw and heartsick. It had taken 2 of her children. Ella squirmed against her. "Oh, it's the butterflies you want," Hattie said. She got a mason jar from the kitchen, went back outside, and captured 2 of them inside. She refused to look at the clock again, but she was as aware of the time passing as she was of her own heartbeat. The butterflies, white as 2 slips of paper, flitted in the jar. Ella was transfixed. In summer, Hattie's girls trapped fireflies. They ripped the glowing bits from the insects' abdomens and put them on their fingers like rings. "Princess Emeralds!" they'd shout and run down the block with the green glow paling on their fingers. Ella banged the butterfly jar with her hands. "Ain't that a purty sight? You poke some holes in that lid and put some grass in the bottom and they'll live till sundown." Willie appeared suddenly in the middle of the sidewalk, leaning on her cane. "It's a shame to kill them. I thought I'd set them free when she gets tired of them," Hattie replied. "Everything got to meet its end somewhere. Over by that there bush or in that jar, I reckon it's the same to them." Willie gestured to Ella. "Look like she got a good disposition. Cranky baby's a hard thing to take. Not as hard as a cranky man, I reckon." She chuckled. "And she full of rolls. That's good coming into winter. Fat baby do all right even if there ain't much beside butter beans and her mama's milk. Fat baby do just fine in a lean winter." "Yes, ma'am," Hattie said. "I guess that's true. I suppose I've managed before." "We all have. Well, I better get on. You ought to step in sometime soon. I'll give you something to help you sleep better. You don't look like yourself." Willie moved off down the street. "I can't do this," Hattie thought. "If I give my child away, I'll crumble. I wouldn't survive it. Maybe it's selfish to keep her from piano lessons and pinafores, but I'm not that strong. I'd disintegrate into nothing and blow away." To Ella, she said, "We'll take our chances." The house smelled faintly of mildew, like laundry left too long on the line on a rainy day. It made Hattie think of things she couldn't stand, hair in the drain or the bathroom grouting gone black with mold. She tidied the living room and put the butterfly jar on the low table near the sofa. Across the street, her neighbors' late-blooming roses drooped on their stems. It occurred to Hattie that it was roses she needed to brighten her living room. She didn't care for them, but Pearl liked sweet, cloying things. Hattie decided to cross the street and cut a few. She'd just gotten her kitchen shears and was standing on the porch when Benny's Buick rolled to a stop in front of the house. "You all are early," she whispered. The sun glinted off of the Buick's chrome fenders, shined on the hood as though it had been blessed by God, and there she was, standing in front of her rented house about to steal some roses from her neighbor. She didn't feel up to the battle she'd have to wage in order to keep Ella. "You all are early," she said again, more loudly this time. Marion was with them. Pearl powdered her nose in the passenger seat. Her hands shook. She looked out at Hattie standing on the steps with the baby in her arms, her soon-to-be baby, her Ella. Hattie was older, that was sure, more lined and serious. She looked tired, too, and her hair was coming loose from the bun at the nape of her neck, but she stood straight and tall, and she still had that something in her bearing that made Pearl feel a little shabby, a little scuffed. She put her compact back into her purse. Hattie looked down from the porch steps. Benny opened Pearl's door. He had always had such good manners. Pearl was powdering her nose like a princess. She looked well-fed, well-manicured. When she got out of the car, she smoothed her skirt with both hands and walked toward the house. Yes, she looked well, though not quite sure of herself. Her eyes were fixed on Ella. She and Hattie looked at each other, then at the baby. Marion broke the silence. "Hattie, my gracious, you are in a state. What are you doing here with those scissors? You look like you've been at the cordial." She glanced anxiously from one sister to the other. "Oh, it's gotten so breezy. Isn't it breezy?" Hattie took a deep breath and descended the stairs. "You all must be tired after all that driving, though it does seem you made good time. Did you make good time, Benny?" "All right time, I guess, Hattie." He took off his hat when she addressed him. There was silence again. Marion said, "Don't you think we should go inside?" She edged past Pearl and Hattie and opened the front door. "Come on, then," she said. "You look well, Hattie," Pearl said. "And the baby? Well, you painted the house since the last time I was here, but that was so long ago. My goodness, glory be, well, this was always such a nice, respectable street." Pearl could not recall ever wanting anything as badly as she wanted to take Ella into her arms. "A very quiet street," she said again. Hattie felt a rush of sympathy for her sister, all trussed up and gloved and too much powder on her face. If the circumstances had been different, she would have reached out and squeezed Pearl's shoulder. Ella nuzzled Hattie's neck like she did whenever strangers came around. "I almost forgot about the chestnuts I gathered," Pearl said. "Benny, go to the car and get the chestnuts." He went back to the car. The women entered the house. The living room was all shadows. Pearl stood in the foyer with her arms hanging limp at her sides. She looked around as though she'd suddenly found herself in a barn. Hattie offered to make them some coffee and started toward the kitchen. Pearl blurted, "Can I hold the baby while you make the coffee?" "I suppose everyone takes milk?" Hattie asked. As she turned to walk down the hallway, she kissed Ella's forehead and pulled at her earlobe because that always made her daughter laugh. She put the water on to boil. There was only a little coffee in the tin at the back of the cupboard, just enough for 2 or 3 cups. I'll tell them I don't take coffee in the afternoon, she thought. She balanced Ella on her hip with one arm and with the other hand took an old serving tray from the hutch and the good cups and the creamer and the sugar bowl. Ella kept reaching for the dishes and Hattie nearly dropped the saucers. She whined as though she might cry, so Hattie wet the tip of her pinky, stuck it in the sugar bowl and put it in Ella's mouth. She leaned against the counter and whispered in Ella's ear while the baby sucked the sugar away. Hattie felt as though she were sliding off the earth. Marion came in. "You need some help? At least let me take the baby while you do that." No, Hattie said, "No, I'm all right." "You all are going to have to get on with things," Marion said. "Coffee's ready. You can carry the tray." Benny had unloaded the things from the car and put them in the middle of the living room floor, a basket of apples and one of string beans, a couple of covered boxes, and a big bag brimming over with what looked like clothes. Next to these, Pearl's chestnuts. It looked as though he'd unloaded a ship. Hattie shifted Ella from one hip to the other. "I am grateful for all of these things, and I do certainly appreciate the trouble you went to, but..." Hattie took a deep breath. "You should keep your things. Ella is staying with me. You can't have her for a bucket of string beans." "Hattie, I brought these things because you're my sister, like I do whenever I come visiting. I brought some things for Marion, too, didn't I?" Pearl looked at Marion. "I don't know how you could say such a thing," Pearl said. "I'll help you take them back out to the car," Hattie said to Benny. He shook his head and looked up at her from underneath his eyelashes. "I think you ought to keep them, if you would. I'd like you to have them, even if," he said. "What is the matter with you, Benny?" Pearl cried. "Hattie, I thought you might need these things." "You don't know what I need, and I'll thank you not to speculate on it," Hattie said. "I've never known anyone so full of foolish pride. Anybody can see you need our help. Just look at the state of this house." "Pearl," Marion said. "I'm sorry, Hattie. I truly am. Excuse me, I'm a little agitated," Pearl said. "I think we're all just a little bit excited. Let's drink our coffee. Why don't you sit down so we can have our coffee?" Pearl said. "I'll stand, thank you," Hattie replied, rubbing the small of Ella's back. I didn't mean what I said. We ought to talk this out. We had an agreement, Hattie. It's all decided. You said yourself that I should come. Now, I'm saying otherwise, Hattie replied. But Hattie, you have to be practical. There's clothes and food to consider, and all of you squeezed into this tiny little house. I know it must be hard, but it's the best thing for Ella. You don't know anything about it. You've never had a child, so you can't say how hard it might be, can you, Pearl? Pearl began to weep. Hattie stood in front of her, rocking Ella. She was sorry to see Pearl cry. She was sorry for her loneliness. Benny looked at his wife like she was a stranger to him, like she was somebody who'd wandered in off the street. But, Hattie thought, her problems aren't mine to fix. She wanted them to leave. She wanted some quiet, an hour of silence before the other children came home from school. There's not much point in going on with this, Hattie said. A whistled tune drifted in from the other side of the door. The knob turned. August stepped in. Y'all already here? He said. He saw Pearl crying and Benny staring at his shoes and Marion sitting there looking like somebody's old aunt. And Hattie like a thundercloud in the middle of the room. I guess things ain't going so well. I didn't reckon they would, he said. Please, August, say something to her, Pearl said. She says she won't give up Ella, but we had an agreement. You know that we did. Nothing I can say. She thinks I'm lower than a cockroach. For goodness sake, August, please, can't you just... You know what? Don't nobody never act like this child is one bit mine. Y'all act like she hatched from an egg. Don't nobody never think maybe it hurts me to see her go. We agreed, Pearl said. We all agreed. This our child, Pearl. You ain't got no right to act like you better than us. A blind man can see that's what you think, and it don't endear you to nobody. You all come from the same parents, you and Hattie. Things took a different turn for her, but you strutting around like a cock in the yard ain't right. Hattie looked over at August, surprised to find an ally in him, hesitant to believe he really was one. I halfway hoped y'all had already be gone when I came home, because I didn't want to see another one of my children taken away. She's not going to be taken away, Hattie said. I changed my mind. August nodded. I was of half a mind to call Pearl myself and tell her not to come. Couldn't stand the thought of losing a child again. I thought it would put me in the floor. Then I realized it ain't the same thing as before. Where are you going with this, August? Hattie asked. I need to say this to you, Hattie, even though you won't want to hear it, especially not from me. You watched our 2 babies go. You nursed them and sang to them and rocked them, and it didn't do no good in the end. August's voice cracked. I won't stand here and tell you what you should do, but I want you to know this ain't that. Ella ain't dying. We had that pain, Hattie, and we'll have this too, but you got to understand this ain't the same thing. Hattie looked at August a long while. No one spoke. Finally, she nodded and he nodded back. Pearl stood and took a step toward Benny, but he was sitting with his head in his hands and did not look at her. Benny won't love Ella, Pearl realized suddenly. She had fooled herself into thinking that he would. Oh, she said aloud and sank down onto the couch. Hattie cupped Ella's head in her hand. Her hair tickled her palm. She touched her fingers to the baby's plump calves and dimpled knees and small, translucent toenails. After a time, August took Ella in his arms and sang to her so quietly she fell asleep. Hattie watched him nuzzle her and remembered his smile when she told him she was pregnant. She remembered her panic and her rage. She had nearly gone to Willie for something to get rid of the pregnancy, and certainly Hattie was glad she hadn't done that. Here was her baby girl in the world. Hattie was grateful for Ella's life, however briefly she'd had a place in it. But then there was this unbearable fact. Hattie was losing another of her children, and she couldn't help but ask herself, God help her, if it wouldn't have been easier if Ella hadn't ever existed and Hattie had never had these 6 months as her mother. How was she supposed to bear a life like this? She looked around the room as if she might find the answer in August's face or Marion's or Pearl's, but her eyes settled on Ella. In that moment, it was no consolation to think she was doing the right thing for her child. Best not to think at all, best to move, because if she didn't, she would fall down and she wouldn't get up again. Hattie stood and climbed the stairs. She came down a few minutes later with Ella's Moses basket and a brown bag. "Here's some of her things," she said to Pearl. "There's a doll baby in here that I made for her. I'm sure you have something fancier, but she likes this one, and it smells like me, so you can give it to her on the ride back if she fusses." Pearl looked at her sister as though she wanted to say something, but didn't know what it ought to be. Hattie took Ella from August's arms. The baby snuffled and whimpered, so Hattie shifted her onto her shoulder and rubbed her back. "She fidgets in her sleep," she said to Pearl. "You have to pick her up and rub her back like this, or she'll wake up howling." She's only my child for a few more minutes, Hattie thought. She wished Ella would wake up so she could see her baby girl's eyes one last time. "You ought to go now, before she wakes up," Hattie said. She handed her daughter to Pearl. "I'm in the floor," she thought. Marion and Benny, Hattie and August, and Pearl, holding Ella, walked out onto the street. Benny opened the car door and settled Pearl and Ella in the passenger seat. He pulled off slowly. Pearl raised her hand in a wave and held it suspended until the car rounded the corner and was gone. "The children will be home from school soon," Hattie said. "I guess they will be," August replied. They went into the house and began carrying the baskets of food into the kitchen. The butterflies were still alive in the mason jar. August turned to her and said, "We gon' make it through, Hattie." She snatched the jar from the table and hurled it at the wall behind August. The two of them watched the white butterflies, stunned and struggling in the broken glass. Thank you.
Is mine on? Yep, I think it is.
Is mine? It is, okay.
Wow, Ayana, I've read the book a couple of times, but I think there's something about an author's reading of their own words that really puts life, I think, to the words. And so thank you so much for sharing that. I mentioned in your introduction that when you were selected for Oprah's book club, you had rather a stunning phone conversation. Can you relate that to us?
Oh, sure. I was on vacation at the time, and the whole Oprah Book Club thing, it's a very sort of secretive, process. So nobody knows except for Oprah and her readers, essentially. She has meeting not the public, but the people that she reads books with. So it's like 3 people know or something like that. And so I was on vacation, and the story's it's really kind of obnoxious because I was on vacation in Paris, and it makes it sound like I'm a person who goes on vacation to Paris and gets phone calls from Oprah, which I'm not. But so I was on vacation, and they had sort of set up this very elaborate ruse whereby they'd said, "Oh, we want to review the book for O Magazine," which is very, very exciting because there are not a lot of publications that have extensive book coverage anymore, and O Magazine is one of them. So we were really excited that was going to happen, and so we were even more excited because they said, "Oh, we're going to do a longer review than just the 2 or 3 sentences," and so we were hoping that they could sort of get a quote from me, and so I on this particular day, it had been raining the whole time that I had been in Paris. And we finally got this one sunny day, and so we sort of got up early, and we were wandering around, and I was all the way across town. I had to be back at 2:00 for this phone call from the books editor, and I had a very kind of like obnoxious, like sort of spoiled diva moment, and I was like, "It's sunny, I don't want to go back. I want to go to the Louvre," And so I went back, and I get back to the apartment we were renting, and I was there for, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes or something. And then it was like 2:05, and the phone didn't ring, and then I'm like really having like a super diva moment. I'm like, "I could be eating crepes, and nobody's even calling me." And so I was just about to sort of call the sort of emergency number they had given me in case they couldn't get through, and it was 212, and the phone rang, and I pick up the phone, and I'm sort of like, hello, and this voice says, this is Oprah Winfrey, and that was really very odd.
And did you believe it immediately?
I didn't. There was a bit of a back and forth of no, it's not, yes, it is, kind of thing. So that must be really tiresome for her. It's just a very strange position to be in the world where you call people and nobody ever thinks it's you. Like,
I'm
how
not
strange,
in that position.
you know what
I
I mean?
imagine. It's a great story. I enjoyed hearing that. One thing, Ayana, doing research on you, I found that you and I have a few things in common. Number one, we both love literature and books. And I too penned a book at age 8, and my mother thought it was so phenomenal she was going to send it to Bennett Cerf. I don't know if that name sounds familiar to you, but he was a big, I know some of you all remember Bennett Cerf, and I don't know why my mom chose, why he would, but unfortunately it was not accepted for publication.
Oh.
But I understand the excitement of being able to see, some works that you have written and come alive in print. Some of our attendees today have similar thoughts about your work. And one question, they are writing down questions. One question is, one comes away from the book with a sense that the failures of Hattie's children are due almost entirely to Hattie's failings. Was it your choice to de-emphasize racism, poverty, and other social issues? And if so, why?
That's a very good question. So I think that their failures are certainly due in large part to Hattie's. They're also due to their own sort of odd psychology. I mean, they are kind of first and foremost individuals with their own sort of strange problems and ennui and weirdnesses. So certainly some of what they do, especially as you get kind of later in the book into chapters like Belle, which is set in 1975, it's sort of entirely because she's like ornery and a bit of a nut, But in terms of race and that kind of thing, what I was interested in doing was, clearly these are black characters, and most of the book is sort of set pre-civil rights. A few of the later chapters are after the civil rights movement, but most of it is before. But I wasn't particularly interested in writing a book that was a kind of definitive black experience book that was about racism. What I wanted to write about, first and foremost, was my characters. And I think that people's experience in the world is not one of kind of wandering around being like, I'm a black person, I'm a Jewish person, I'm Chinese. That's not how you integrate your own being into your sort of understanding of who you are. You're aware of who you are, but you kind of don't go around thinking about yourself with kind of a label on your head. That's not how we experience the world. And I think also, the pressures that are being exerted on these people and this community are certainly present, but they don't completely define who these people are, just as sort of they don't define kind of who anybody is, So I was much more interested in writing a novel that was first and foremost about these particular people and their particular experience, with, of course, the awareness that there is, the sort of questions of race and of class are kind of like an invisible hand really squeezing them in certain ways. But it was not my interest to kind of write about that in a way that was particularly, I suppose, overt, because I think it's, I think also that, certainly there are incredible writers, black writers, who have come before me and have done that work in a way that makes it, they've done a lot of heavy lifting for me so that, in 2013, I can write my characters. I don't have the sort of burden of kind of having to say, this is what it means to be black in America. And it was my interest to do that. And I'm so grateful to so many who came before me who did that so that I can kind of come along and write a story.
Thank you. One other thing that we share in common is you, in an interview, stated that you had read the Great Migration story by Isabel Wilkerson. She came to Des Moines, Iowa about 20 years ago and wrote a story about the Des Moines School District. And we were struggling with some desegregation issues at that time. So I had the chance to be interviewed by Isabel. She is amazing.
She's brilliant.
So when I saw that you kind of share my feeling about her. But her book on the Great Migration talks a lot about the stresses on the African-American family during that period of time. Yeah. What was your thinking as you kind of wove that into your story?
Well, it's interesting, when I started writing the book, I had no sense that I was writing about the Great Migration, nor was it my intention. What kind of happened was that as I and I also didn't necessarily realize at first that I was writing a book that was about Hattie, and in many ways it's certainly also about her children. And as I wrote through the stories, I probably got to about the third or the fourth one before I even realized that I was writing a book. And I sort of, being a little bit slow on the uptake as I am, I thought, oh, this is so funny. There's all of these people, and it's like 1952, and they keep being in Philadelphia. It's weird. I wonder why I can't, And then it was like, oh, duh, they're like, they're in a family, And so then as soon as I realized that these people sort of were all of a piece in terms of from a family, then it became very important to think about sort of who their parents were and where they had come from, and I understood fairly quickly that Hattie was not kind of Philadelphia born, that she'd come from somewhere else, and so that's sort of how the Great Migration sort of came into it, because it couldn't sort of write a story with a mother of children who are coming of age in the 50s. She would have had to have been born, like in the very, very early part of the 20th century, and if she'd come from somewhere else and left that place, then certainly they would have been a part of a migratory family. So I think, I tend not to really write. I tend not to write to theme. It tends to be sort of tinny and not true to me. Like I have to write people first and foremost, and then I can think about other implications. But certainly, they are. The book is also very interested in talking about how these people kind of came from where they came from under such incredible duress and such incredible difficulty, and the ways in which the Great Migration really did, sort of entirely change the face of America, not just, demographically, but also, culturally, intellectually, in all ways. We wouldn't have jazz if there had been no Great Migration, which is, that's a pretty significant thing, So as I sort of wrote through and began to understand how much they would also have been shaped by sort of where they'd come from and the fact that they were on the sort of early end of a movement that is so kind of unsung but is of such kind of astronomical importance, again, it sort of goes back to the first race question. I didn't want to be overt about it, but certainly it is very much a part of the book.
Interesting. Well, why did you choose the structure that you did, which was almost a series of linked short stories?
It sort of came about, it's so funny when people ask that question, it's like you want to, like when you sort of have a book out in the world, you have to sort of invent this narrative, when you're like, well, actually I'm a genius, and I was walking along one day eating an ice cream cone, and I thought to myself, I shall pen a great book, but which is not at all what happened. Basically, I was stuck on another book that I was writing and had to abandon it because it was like bad, and so then I thought, well, I'm going to write some short stories, and so I was writing these short stories, and as I said, I got to sort of the third and fourth one, and they kept being in Philadelphia, and it kept being the 50s, and then finally I was like, oh, I get it. And by that time, the structure had sort of very much kind of presented itself, and as I realized that she was going to have so many children, and as I realized that she herself, meaning she, Hattie, is what I mean, was so complex, I didn't, sort of trying to understand her through a more conventional narrative arc seemed to be a thing that would have been ineffective and too much. And so it was also, as much as I wanted to write about these children, I also wanted to write about her, but she was very difficult to get at in a more conventional kind of way. She's much easier to understand for me as a writer, and I think also just sort of in the functioning of the book through, if she's kind of reflected through the prisms of all of these children, she becomes much more nuanced.
Very much so nuanced. How did you then get into the heart and soul of the men in the book?
Well, I think we sort of have all these I think false distinctions about sort of who's able to access what in certain kinds of ways, because I think and I think it's particularly a question that women writers get asked, because people don't often ask men how they write about women, but people are always asking women how they write about men. And which seems to me to be, there's something a little wonky about that, simply because the imagination is the imagination, and its power and its fluency and its breadth can do all kinds of things, I think. So at the end, I think it's just a question of imagination, I suppose, and sort of allowing yourself to wander around a little bit.
Well, speaking of the imagination, were parts of the characters or any of the characters in any way an autobiographical background for you?
No, not really. I mean, Hattie is very, very, very loosely based on my grandmother, or not even based, I think inspired. My grandmother was, she's not from Georgia, but she did come from the South to Philadelphia in the very early part of the 20th century. And she had a lot of children, not as many children as Hattie has, but she had a lot of children. And if there was anything about her, she was sort of, she was a very stoic woman. She was kind of stoic and unknowable. Not like Hattie, because Hattie, sort of is prone to kind of rages, in a way that my own grandmother wasn't. But I think if anything, without understanding the extent to which I was curious about who my grandmother was, I think I was. It's amazing, your sort of obsessions and curiosities and the ones that you don't really know that you have, and then when you try and sit down to write something as kind of time-taking and time-consuming as a book, your obsessions present themselves, and so I think I was not necessarily trying to figure out my grandmother, but certainly she was somebody I wanted to know and didn't in many ways.
I did read an interview with you that you did in the last couple of chapters touch mental illness.
Yeah.
And this is an area that you have written about beyond this novel. Do you feel that's an area that may be missing, particularly in African American literature?
I think so. I think that it really is. I think particularly in African American literature, and I think in literature in general, it sort of remains some of our last taboos, and we've gotten to a point where we can sort of talk about things like depression, and everybody, whatever, and that's something that seems to be at least sort of discussed in the media, but other kinds of mental illnesses that are more serious, I think, are still seen as very, very taboo. And I think among Black people particularly, mental illness is sort of extra taboo. And also, and it's interesting because I think it's, one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about that is also because at the sort of, without giving away anything, in the last chapter, one of the children is quite ill. Her name is Cassie. And Hattie, at some point, sort of is thinking about Cassie. And Hattie, in her very proud, very old-fashioned, very bougie kind of way, a little part of her thinks that Hattie could kind of do better if she could just get her act together. But Cassie is really, deeply unwell. But anyway, so Hattie at some point says, well, if this had happened in the South, where I come from, when I was a young person, we would have just kind of, somebody would have taken her to the church and had her prayed over, and if that didn't work, we would have just sort of left her to her own devices, and somebody would have made sure she had clothes and food, and that would have been that, And so there's this aspect of sort of making do and getting by, and trying to at once ignore anomalous behavior and not completely ostracize it, but neither of those actually sort of neither of those actually deals with it, And so it seemed important that in a book like this that is, sort of is very much about a kind of, as much as it's about characters, it's also sort of emblematic of this first generation of migrants to the North. It seemed very important that would have to be kind of, present in a way that couldn't be ignored, and also to explore Hattie's reaction to it.
Well, thanks for sharing that and bringing to light, you're right, a very important topic for our community.
Thank you.
Can you tell us why you wrote the book in longhand?
I can't. It's the first drafts I write in longhand because I think I went through a phase early on in the writing of the book where I got really stuck. And it was probably not coincidentally coincided with when I realized that I had a book and it wasn't just short stories. So I think I basically got really cold feet. And so I went through about a month where I couldn't sort of I couldn't write an entire paragraph, because I would write a paragraph and then I would just delete. And this went like on and on and on every day for about a month. I would write 4 sentences, delete, sometimes. And this would be, 4 or 5 hours each day. And so it was, as you can imagine, it was very frustrating and like a little bit terrifying. I was also in graduate school at the time, so I was like, oh, I have to take something in a workshop. Oh God, so it's really stressful. And so I was talking to Marilyn Robinson actually, and she was saying, I write everything in longhand. And I thought, oh, maybe I'll try and see what happens. And it was just really freeing because when I write in longhand, it just feels like I can be as messy or as ugly with as many crappy, dowdy, awful sentences as there are, and it's my notes. And there's something about typing first that feels very kind of official to me, or like I should make fewer mistakes or something like that. In longhand, it's just, big crappy mess, and then later I can deal with it. Very freeing.
And certainly you want to, we all probably remember our second grade handwriting course. And so there's a little bit of legacy that we all spent so much time learning how to write, My children, it's all on the computer and they never get to see their own words. So it's
very
a lost start. It's a lost start.
I mean, my notebooks aren't you should see. It's just like, sometimes when I would be doing second draft, I'd be like, what does that say? Like a whole paragraph. I'd be like, and then Hattie went where? It was just very, it was very confusing. But anyway.
Cool. Well, I'm sure most of us are so grateful that you decided to come to Iowa, and tell us just a bit why you chose the Iowa Writers Workshop, or the meaning for you in your life of the Iowa Writers Workshop.
Well, the work, I had no plans at all of going to, I've been writing all my life, but I didn't sort of have career aspirations as a writer. I assumed that, I was like, well, I'll always write, and maybe one day I'll write a book. I figured I would, but I assumed that it would always be sort of something that I did on the side. I didn't really have a sort of career kind of way of thinking about it. So when I applied, and I had no thoughts of trying to get an MFA or anything like that. I had a dear friend who's also a writer, and he wrote his name is Justin Torres, wrote an incredible book called We the Animals that I recommend you all read. But at any rate, he came to Iowa sort of the year before I did, and I came to visit him, and I had been writing kind of a lot more. I've had a very kind of on and off again relationship with writing. Been doing it all my life, but it sort of, like a bad lover kind of relationship, you need to be like, I love you, we're gonna be together forever, and then 6 months, I hate you, get out of my house, like it was kind of like this back and forth, endless back and forth. So I got to sort of my mid to late 30s, and it just became sort of more urgent and more pressing. And then this dear friend went to Iowa, and it's it's an amazing program. It really it really changed my life and met incredible people there. So yeah, it's meant everything. The entire book was written there. So.
And very competitive. You're being very humble. We know that to even be accepted in this outstanding program, it takes quite a gift and talent. So.
Thank you.
But we're glad that you chose to share it with us. How did you determine the title?
The title, I always get, it's definitely, people ask me this, and I always don't remember when it happened exactly. It was even sort of in the early chapters, but the title is a direct allusion, obviously, to the 12 tribes of Israel, the biblical 12 tribes of Israel from the Old Testament, and because I was really interested in. It was a perfect metaphor, essentially, because I was interested in sort of a group of people who move from a situation of bondage into a situation of freedom, to find that their sort of freedom is as a very mingled and more complicated thing than they thought that it would be, which is, of course, exactly sort of the situation with in the Old Testament, sort of out of slavery in Egypt, and then wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, and then finally you get to the promised land, and along come the Babylonians, and then there's bad king, all these kinds of very difficult things happen, and so they had to sort of they're sort of constantly renegotiating their relationship with God, of course, but also with their freedom. And that seemed a very apt metaphor for what I was trying to write about.
Well, sometime when you and I have time, I found your 8 favorite books that was published somewhere, and I've read all of them, but I was really intrigued by, I'll tell the audience, they were Beloved, Toni Morrison, As I Lay Dying, William Faulkner, Thomas and Beulah, Rita Dove, Magic City, Yusuf, and was he a...
Kumanyaka, he's a poet. Yeah.
Was he, University of Iowa? Connection?
I was
thinking he was.
I don't remember whether he did or not. People have said this to me, and I don't know if it's the case or not. I'm actually not sure.
Okay. Anita Barrow's The Book of Hours, The Children's Hospital. And of course, I work at a medical center, so this is very appealing to me.
It's beautiful.
And The Collected Stories of Udella Welty and The Fire Next Time, James Baldwin. Great list of books. But as I said, unfortunately don't have time to talk about that today because I understand that you are heading back to Iowa City for an important part of your engagement. So we do want to thank the audience for coming today and enjoying along with myself this wonderful, gifted author. And for those of you who may not have had your book signed earlier, they are still available. Is that correct, Jan? There's a book plate that can be used for that. Thank you for that. And anything else that I should share at this point?
Remind everybody to fill out their evaluation forms because we'll be drawing whoever you have.
Well, please join me in thanking Ayana Mathis.
Thank you so much.